Upstanding happens one act, one moment, one strength at a time, and standing up changes everything. This is the Upstander Ripple Effect.
Hi, I'm Kevin Aldrich.
And I'm Jackie Congedo.
And welcome to the Upstander Ripple Effect. This is Season 2, Episode 6. And today we're going to be talking about the intersection between Black History Month and Women's History Month. And we've got another great show. And so, Jackie, why don't you introduce our great guest that we have with us?
Yeah, so this is an awesome opportunity to bring Shawnee Turner into the conversation, who is the Vice President of Education and Interpretation at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center here in Cincinnati. Wonderful treasure in our community. And just thinking about, again, this intersection of Black history and women's history, I think there are maybe very few others in our city who have quite the perspective that you do, working in a space that's really all about how to teach at the intersection of these themes and how to resource the conversation locally, but also nationally. Tell us a little bit about your background. What brought you to this role, and sort of what's a day in the life like for you at the Freedom Center?
So I actually come to this role maybe just slightly circuitously. I was an art history professor. Well, before then it was something else, but I was an art history professor and kind of got tired of the adjunct life. I was working, at different places, and decided I really wanted to devote my time to museums. I spent about 10 years in another museum before coming to the Freedom Center. But when I read the job description for my current position, I knew it was what I wanted. I wanted something more out of my life where I was showing up every day. I wanted something that was just a little bit more devoted to my leanings with social justice and the ability to impact others that way. So that's what really kind of led me to the Freedom Center. Yeah.
So your job must be interesting, particularly in these kind of political times that we're in now with attacks on DEI and education and things like that. How have you seen that impact what you do in your role, and how are you kind of trying to counteract some of the political winds that are moving against some of the things that places like the Freedom Center teach?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've noticed is that, honestly, the public is incredibly supportive. When I go out, because I go out to tabling events just as much as my program manager and docents and things do. And the folks in the public are just grateful that we are here and that we are continuing with our mission unapologetically. It's nice to get that reassurance when you come out into the public, because you never know, what you're going to encounter. And for us, we've really kind of doubled down on a lot of those efforts. We recently started something called Be the Conductor. It's the Young Changemakers Social Justice Leadership Lab. It's a mouthful, but it's a program that's geared toward people who are about 18 to 25. We're flexible, but it's looking at college students and people in their early career and giving them the tools they need to be able to bring themselves in leadership positions, be mindful of social justice and how they can bring that into their everyday lives. So for us, honestly, we're continuing on. And sure, it's scary, but I think it just adds momentum for us in many ways.
Have you guys seen any, because in addition to sort of talking about the history of the Underground Railroad and Black history, one of the things that you have focused in on has been human trafficking and modern day slavery. Have you seen any increased interest in those sorts of exhibits, given everything that we've, again, seeing in the news around Jeffrey Epstein and highlighting that? How has that come into sort of the atmosphere at the Freedom Center and what you guys are teaching to the community?
Yeah, I actually am an avid reader of our surveys. Mm-hmm. So, I have noticed an uptick in people commenting, particularly around our invisible exhibition and our interactive called Shine the Light. And I think it's because before, honestly, the Epstein files became widespread news, these were things that not a lot of people knew was still going on. And so now that it is more out there, I think in some ways that exhibition becomes even more impactful. And we are working with some community partners to bring in some additional information around particularly, Pakistani and Indian trafficking, especially. So that'll actually be coming up in the month of May, and you'll get to see that. So it is something we continue to really look at and try to bring some interpretation and some understanding to.
Yeah, so going back to your young leadership work, I saw this announcement about the recruiting for this cohort, which sounds really exciting. It reminded me actually a lot of the work that some of the work Kevin and I have done together with the Leaders in Light program that the Jewish Community Relations Council launched a number of years ago, which is ongoing. And so I actually had made a point to give you a nudge before we left today, because I think there's a lot of crossover there and opportunity maybe to think together and help each other. But in thinking about like cultivating young leaders, one of the conversations we wanted to have today was around someone who I think was such a singular force in the space of sort of cultivation of next generation leadership for civil rights. And a singular force, in that there really was no one quite like Reverend Jesse Jackson, who unfortunately the world lost on February 17th at the age of 84 after his battle with Parkinson's. And I think, when I say singular, I also mean that, as we know, with figures throughout history, we talk about this with upstanders too. Oftentimes, it's rare that you have someone with a legacy that's, perfectly, that's uncomplicated, right? Yeah. Like we all live complicated lives in increasingly complex times. Mm-hmm. And we evolve as human beings, and we learn and we change. And sometimes we don't change as much as some people wish we would change. And so I'm just interested to kind of unpack that in our conversation today. The legacy of Reverend Jackson and all of the incredible work and progress and change making and inspiring of young leaders. That work he led, that was essential to the progress in terms of the way we've seen things evolve, and also the sticking points along the way, of which there were a number, particularly in the space of sort of relationship with the Jewish community, the legacy of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Israel. So maybe we can just kind of start there. Could you share just a little bit about, the Freedom Center, I know, had put out a statement in the wake of his passing. Tell us a little bit about how your team has been reflecting on the legacy of Reverend Jackson and where you feel that legacy leaves us today in terms of this work.
I think about the Freedom Center's mission to kind of start. We state that our purpose is the pursuit of inclusive freedom through social justice. And we build upon the principles of the Underground Railroad to do that. And the things that we often cite for that are cooperation. We talk about courage, and we talk about perseverance. And honestly, Reverend Jackson's legacy is all of those things. We are able to kind of track the work that he did throughout his life, and make it akin to the abolitionists and conductors from the 19th century. He didn't wait for the world to change. Harriet Tubman didn't wait for the world to change. They changed it. Reverend Jackson went into rooms where he was not welcome. He ran for office when people said he couldn't win, and he spoke these truths. He made people uncomfortable, but the things that he advocated for are still things we're fighting for, whether we're talking about, equality or healthcare for all, or access to education, access to housing, pay equity. These are things that maybe were better at different points in his life, but it reminds us that these are human rights across the world, which he advocated for, that we should all be considering. And as activists, we know that we have to continue that fight. We have to kind of overcome certain things as we continue. And we need to basically act in our own corners of the world to be able to make that difference. Sometimes they're really big things, and sometimes they're very small. And I think that's one of the examples that he gave throughout his work. Um, Even his ideas around community engagement, whether he's talking about Operation Breadbasket or eventually the Rainbow Push Coalition, these were ways, they were roadmap that where we can look at people and organizations in our community and find aligned missions and continue that work to move it forward. And I think that's what we as an institution take from his work, particularly because it's the work that we're trying to do as well.
I was looking at your colleague Byron McCauley's really, I think, beautifully stated op-ed about his life and legacy. And he was reminding us in this op-ed that Reverend Jackson was in front of the editorial board back in, I don't know, was it 2017? You had said
2018, 2017, somewhere around
almost
that time
10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that you were in that room.
I was.
So I'm just curious, like, what was it like to be in that room with him? And,
It was fantastic. I mean, as a kid who grew up seeing Reverend Jackson run for the Democratic nomination in 1988 and just seeing him as someone who just sort of repositioned what was possible for Black Americans in that time and not being limited by people who are saying that you could never compete or that you could never win. I think Reverend Jackson showed, that to be not the case. And with his, sort of trademark, some of his trademark quotes, his "I am somebody," he embodied that and epitomized that for a lot of Black folks, including me, about what the possibilities are that you could be. So meeting him in up close and in person, as I can say only a handful. I've met many people, many famous people, but there probably only been a handful of times where I've just, as a reporter or someone in the media, has just been awestruck by meeting someone. It's not often you meet people that you sort of idolize and sort of set up on this pedestal, and when you actually meet them in person, they're actually larger than life in person as they are outside
lives
of that.
up to the
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even at that time, I think Reverend Jackson had just been diagnosed, and you could see that there were some signs of decline kind of taking place. He still was a force of nature. He still, spoke very passionately and forcefully behind what he believed. And you could just see the giant of a man that he was. So it was kind of tough to be there and sort of, get out of that space and put
Kevin,
on
you got to do your job.
Yeah, and put on your journalism hat and do your job. And so it's actually one of the great moments for me to be able to have that experience with him.
Yeah. And you were saying you got a picture with him. And
I did get a picture with him, and it's right up there with my picture of Vanessa Williams, which ironically I got because she was one of the Freedom Center's ambassadors when they first opened the Freedom Center here, and I got to interview her at Saks Fifth Avenue. That's a whole other story for another time. But yeah, my picture of Reverend Jackson and her have a special place in my collection.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is amazing. So yeah, Byron had shared that, thinking about how we honor the legacy of these giants. I think in so many ways it's important to, as he said so eloquently, really to humanize, right? Because so often we think about these figures as people who, as you said, are larger than life. These are, they're outside of our scope of what we could possibly become because they're so grand in their impact and in sort of their persona, public persona. But remembering that, who was Jesse Jackson? He was a human being. He was a human being just like you and I, and he had good days and bad days. He made mistakes and did great things. And so, saying in Byron's words, how do we honor a man like Jackson? Not with sainthood. He never asked for that. But not with silence either. He deserved better than that, better than to fade quietly. We honor him by doing the work, vote in every election, local and national, defend the rights of those whose voices are ignored, teach our children the history he lived, demand accountability from institutions still struggling with diversity and equity, keep hope alive, not as a slogan, but as a discipline. I think those are really instructive words. And this idea that, again, if we put him on a pedestal, out of sort of reach, then how do we hope to inspire others to make everyday choices like his, unless we can remember that he was just someone who was like us? And what does that mean? That means that he was imperfect. You know, he didn't get it right all the time.
And most of us don't, grow up and evolve in the spotlight. I mean, all of us in front of national and international cameras where, all of us have had a point of view that we've believed at one point in our life, and then had a life experience, wisdom, new information allows us to evolve our positions and thoughts on things. But when you're in the political sphere and you're like that, a lot of times people don't allow us to have those same types of public growth without, constantly judging us on what we have said in the past or what we have done in the past. And I think that, anybody that you've seen who has been a great or impactful leader has had some form of evolution, right? They've never been the same if they've been on the scene for quite some time. And I think you could probably say that about, Reverend Jackson, who grew up as a protege to King. And let's give him credit for that. I mean, how many people have come in the shadow of greatness and gone on to achieve greatness themselves? Like, most people fall woefully short of trying to be the follow-up to the person who's great.
That's
Jesse
quite
Jackson,
the act to follow.
Yeah. And Jesse Jackson was able to carve his own lane and create his own sense of impact and fame that carried on, not only carried on King's tradition, but allowed him to become his own type of leader in that same regard. So I don't think he gets enough credit for that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth there. So I want to also just kind of name and talk a little bit about some of the tensions, related to his work, his positions, which seem to, as you said, evolve a bit around sort of his relationship with the Jewish community, specifically, I think, really coming out of the Black Jewish Civil Rights Alliance, and, the way sort of geopolitics evolved, the way, the complications with sort of his association with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, there were some pretty problematic moments, I think, along the way there. And in some ways, I actually think there are learning opportunities for all of us, actually, because we tend to see, Kevin, you and I have talked about this, I feel like so many different times. They're emblematic of how we tend to have our blinders on. We have our experience, our lived experience that's dictated by, the threats and opportunities we perceive, what it's like to walk around the world with our identities, right? And so that's the primary thing, as we're thinking about that. And then there's these other things that are more peripheral that we come into contact with, and we don't always get them right, or we don't always have the full picture when we say something. And like you said, especially if you've got cameras on you and reporters on you all the time and you're learning. So I have so much, I think, empathy and space for that kind of growth. But I'm just curious, when we think about some of these stumbles, which were significant along the way related to Reverend Jackson's relationship with the Jewish community and Jewish issues, what do you make of that? I'm just curious kind of how you think back on those.
Yeah, I think, and you and I have talked
points.
about.
And Shawnee, you weigh into it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, Shawnee, and feel free as a guest if you want to jump in.
She's just watching the ping pong match.
Yeah, no, look, Jackie, you and I have had these conversations offline, and we've talked about sort of the complex history between Black Americans and Jews that has been one of great cooperation and also some tough disagreements and different views of things. And I think, Reverend Jackson is representative of that, and I think that each of us, culturally, religiously have our lenses through which we view things. And while we have both been victims of atrocities, whether you're talking about the Holocaust or the slavery, so there's commonality in a sense of injustice and suffering and persecution. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. There are still the trappings of racial politics in America that have made the Jewish experience coming out of the Holocaust here in the United States very different from African Americans' experience in America coming out of slavery. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of that has been at the source of some of the tensions. And we've talked about how, why sometimes so many Black Americans identify with the Palestinians versus Jews, and the differences there, and the complex history of the fact that a lot of Jews provided African Americans places to live and jobs and things of that nature coming out of slavery and Jim Crow, because, traditional white culture wouldn't give you those opportunities. And so naturally you have the tensions that take place between boss and employee, landlord and tenant, those sorts of things that complicate, the cultural relations. And so I think you really kind of got to dig beneath the surface to examine some of these things. I say all the time, Louis Farrakhan is one of those individuals. When you look at him, he undoubtedly says, so many things that are anti-Semitic, but this is the same guy who organized, the Million Man March, and speaks very positively about things that are necessary to uplift and build the Black community. The Nation of Islam has a reputation of rescuing a lot of, young Black men from drugs and poverty. And you have these complexities of these individuals and these geopolitical issues that it's not always so simple as to say, Reverend Jackson or Minister Farrakhan said things that I think we would all agree from a Jewish perspective are not acceptable, right? But then that's also the backdrop of so many other things that I think Black Americans can say that they feel like these are folks who are championing the cause for justice and equality. And so it's unfortunate, I think, you wish folks could always say the right things and always get along, but unfortunately, that's the complexity of how we have to try to navigate and deal with each other and our differences.
Yeah. Shawnee, anything you would want to add there?
I'm reflecting on what you said, when I was, just absorbing a lot of the media that was coming in after Reverend Jackson died. I was struck by the Sesame Street clip where he is talking to the children and he says, "Now repeat after me, I am somebody." Mm-hmm. When you said that, it made me think of it. And I remember watching that. I don't think I was alive when it first came out, but I remember watching it. And the way I take it as a white woman, is he's trying to get us to acknowledge and also advocate for our humanity. Mm-hmm. Despite any difference, whether that, be race or ethnicity, religion or gender or socioeconomic class, you are a person and you deserve that, and you deserve to be respected that way. And I think the one thing we have to embrace, and in some ways the beauty about humanity, is exactly what you said. We make mistakes. And we will continue to make mistakes. The beauty of that is that we get to fix it, but how we atone for that, how we move forward is what matters. And I think that was kind of the point you were getting to in talking about some of those reflections. How did he move forward?
Yeah.
How do we move forward when we make those? We don't want to hurt people, as you're saying, but sometimes we do.
Yeah.
And we have to acknowledge that and try to be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of like public examples of learning is important too, right? To show that people can evolve and people can. And by the way, so much of this has to do with proximity and relationship. I'm thinking about, the gentleman who accompanied him on his trip to the Middle East in the 70s. One of them was one of the organizers, co-organizers in sort of the Black Jewish coalition that came together to stand up against the Nazi march in Skokie, which, by the way, is where the Skokie Illinois Holocaust Museum stands. And so on one hand, you have, a figure who stood at the forefront of the Black community and said, we are here with you to oppose these hateful forces, to oppose this ideology that led to the murder of 6 million Jews and so many others. And on the other hand, he's, on a plane and who knows, a moment of relative casual conversation saying like, I'm tired of hearing about the Holocaust. We got to move on, which is deeply offensive. And to the point where, if if somebody were saying, I'm tired of hearing about slavery, it's time to move on. Goodness knows we hear that. So, this is the complexity of individuals, right? That like, who knows what the context was, what else was going on for him at the time. I mean, I think so often what happens in sort of Black Jewish spaces is that, we feel like it's like the oppression Olympics, right? It's like who's winning who has it worse, who has the bigger need for allyship. And I think that's a race to the bottom. And it's a game that the other side wants to play to divide and conquer. So, I think that the more we can have leaders who are engaged in proximity with each other, who are engaged in those kind of rainbow coalitions, right? That like are necessary for enduring progress, who can inevitably deal with the implications of that, which is sticky issues that come up. We're not going to agree on everything, but we can sit at the table and agree on some fundamental pieces that move us forward. And the way we can have people who can lead with some measure of humility to say, like, I made a mistake. That was a terrible thing I said. I shouldn't have said it. I think it's really important. So, a complex legacy, but undoubtedly a legacy that is emblematic of the kind of progress that I think we hope we can continue to see in our world, and the kind of coalition work that is anything but smooth, right?
Yeah.
But important.
And I think, the other thing about his legacy is that's strong is the fact that we're here talking about it. Not only the things he accomplished, but his mistakes and what we can learn from it, right? Like that's as much a part of the legacy as anything for people who live their lives so out in front of us and so constant, as we get to see and maybe have a little bit of our own sort of hindsight, looking at history and being able to learn and say, how does the next generation of leaders learn how to do it better, than Reverend Jackson did? Learn from his mistakes, take the good things, but then also learn from the mistakes and the evolution and how do we get better. And I think that's one of the things that I've enjoyed about conversations like these and in the retrospect is not to ignore his flaws or his blemishes or necessarily make excuses from them, but to say, hey, he learned from them, and what can we learn from him? How can we be better in 2026 than he was back then? And so that's a great part of conversations like these.
Yeah.
And hopefully we do more of that than using these as just an opportunity to throw darts at his legacy, but just say, hey, he taught us on many different levels about how we can get this thing right.
Yeah, and what like I was saying, what the actual work of broad coalition building requires, which is why I think the work you're doing with young leaders is so important. It's just to have these kinds of coalition, the kind of leadership capacity that can navigate through times like we're living in a way that is enduring, that brings people along, is so important. And so I want to pivot for the sort of the final part of our conversation to this intersection of Black history and women's history, and how we think about not only Reverend Jackson's legacy as it relates to sort of that intersection, but also the work that the Freedom Center is doing at the intersection of sort of women's rights and civil rights. Do you want to speak a little bit to sort of your perspective on how these two issues have sort of traditionally been treated, and what the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center's approach to sort of incorporating these into the broader historical narrative looks like?
Yeah, of course. I think it's interesting. Again, I read a lot of the visitor comments. When we get people from all over the world coming into the museum, and they expect, of course, because of our name, to learn about the Underground Railroad, but what they often don't expect is to hear stories about women or about disability rights or LGBTQ rights. And when they do, sometimes it can kind of take them aback. But when we try to explain that that's what the inclusive freedom part actually means, I think sometimes then they start to begin to understand that the question has become so much more broad. Personally, I'll give an anecdotal story. When I was teaching, I taught a course called Women in the Arts. And that first day, I would tell the students to take out a pencil and a piece of paper, and I'd say, I'm giving you 3 minutes. I want you to write down as many female artists as you can think of. They'd normally be finished writing by about 45 seconds, and then they'd just sit there and stare at me. And then I'd have them read them all off. I'd put them on the board. We'd normally get maybe 8 to 10 names. And then I'd say, okay, so how many of these artists are Black? How many of these artists are Indigenous? How many of these artists are Latino, Asian?
Jewish.
And there'd normally be like one, and it would be Frida Kahlo, right? And they only really knew her because of the movie, right? I mean, and that kind of resurgence of understanding. And, going on to explain to them that, the General Art Historical Survey didn't include women until 1986. There were no women artists in surveys before then. And, art history isn't unique in that. When we talk about any history, we know that the powerful write history. We know about the omissions, particularly around women, non-white folks, not non-cis, Anglo. Those histories haven't really been considered until the last 30 to 40 years, in all actuality. So we're trying to build maybe some of that recognition and embracing intersectionality. And I think that intersectionality is a really big component, also a relatively new concept, and something I think Reverend Jackson really began to understand later on in his life as well. So we're trying to tell those stories in a way that embraces multiple identities, to help people just broaden their perspectives and empathize a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm, was thinking about the legacy of amazing women who I know, and wanted to hear if you, have a particular, or maybe a few sort of heroes, female heroes in your life who you think about as particularly inspirational or important in your work, who you'd like to share in honor of Women's History Month.
Of course. So, we all know about, Harriet Tubman. I won't use the word, but she's amazing, in terms of her work, obviously freeing enslaved people, but also just her military work, and just amazing individual. People like a Margaret Gardner. One of the people I like to tell people about when they come to the Freedom Center is a woman named Ellen Craft. And Ellen was born enslaved in Georgia. She was born to a mixed race enslaved woman, and her father was her enslaver. So Ellen was very fair skinned. She eventually marries another enslaved man named William. And he is lucky enough to be able to gain some money of his own doing extra carpentry work. And so they decide to escape. And she dresses as a man, pretends to be his master. They're able to purchase train tickets, steamship tickets. She goes so far to feign illness so she doesn't have to speak much, puts her arm in a sling so she doesn't have to disclose that she has, no writing ability. And they make it to Philadelphia on Christmas Day in 1848. Wow. To me, that kind of story is just phenomenal. To think about the meticulous planning it took to free herself and her husband, and to move that way, and the danger that they were in. Eventually moved to England when the Fugitive Slave Act was put into practice in 1850. But then after the Civil War, moved back to the United States and started a school for freed people in Georgia. And I think about, what it takes to move through those types of those struggles, and then to even want to come back to the United States and to give back in a space where you grew up. And I think that's very admirable. So I love telling her story. You mentioned heroes, and, I'm just going to keep it really in home. I think our everyday heroes are really important. And I think about my grandmother quite often. She was married at 15. She had a grade school education. to a much older man. She wound up having 4 children. My grandfather was incredibly abusive, and she left him. She left him in the 1960s. I mean, leaving a situation like that is difficult at any point in history, but you think about what it would have been like in the 1960s to go out on your own and live as a single mother and raise 4 children, working in a factory, just making it work and still raise them to be kind, given, community oriented people. Seriously, I don't think I've ever met a more fierce and kind person. She taught me the importance of just quiet strength. So I think just kind of looking for those people in our lives, those women in our lives who can give us those examples.
Feels like you are the inheritor of that
I hope
quiet
so.
strength.
I can only hope to be the woman she was. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Wow. I was thinking about, as you were talking, about this incredible woman who freed herself, freed her husband, and then came back to the United States after the Civil War. And, the first thing that popped into my mind was like the similar sort of almost like restorative justice work that our survivors have championed. And, I guess a more like a more similar parallel would be those who decided, I'm going back to Germany. And actually we see, more and more growing numbers of people who are looking to reclaim their German or Polish or, Eastern European, Lithuanian, Latvia citizenship. Because they feel like, I don't necessarily plan to move there, but I want to reclaim what was taken from me. Like, this was mine and it was taken from me. Which is really brave. But even in the context of like the American telling of this history, the fact that the whole field of Holocaust education in America was really built by survivors, and the courage that it takes to come here with all this trauma and every reason to say, like, I have no hope for humanity, right? Like, I've seen the absolute depths of the worst possible human treatment. And not only am I going to live on in a way that's like hopeful and inspiring, I'm so hopeful that I'm gonna devote my lives to telling my story, because I think that education transforms for people, and that we're not just preconditioned to be bad, right? That we can just as we can make everyday choices to be bad, we can make everyday choices to be great. And that is so inspiring to me. This act of like, it's a similar act. I'm actually thinking about, in this case, Jim Tojo, who is the chief medic for the Cincinnati Fire Department, who was imprisoned in the Japanese American internment camps out west, and like petitioned the government to serve in the American military because he believed so passionately in what this country stood for.
Sure.
Or so many, we were having this conversation last time with Dan Hurley, right? The, members of the armed services who were Black, who were fighting for freedoms they didn't even really fully have themselves in this country during the war. It's just incredible. I don't know. Those stories really get me.
Yeah. I think those are all values and principles that people believe in that are part of who they are. And I think there's something about trying to go back and reform, restore.
It doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when you've lost loved ones or lives have been lost on a soil, you feel a certain investment there to go back and make that worth something, not to let that just be in vain. So I think that's what in some ways drives a lot of people who will return to the scene of their persecution, their mistreatment and injustice, and want to rebuild or refight or reestablish themselves here. And I think it's what also creates, I think, a very complicated sort of emotional view of where you are. Like a lot of times I think in America, in the telling of history, when African Americans in this country tell their history, it's painted as hate of country. Just think about that. Just imagine if the history that you lived, your forefather and mothers lived, that the actual telling of that was viewed as hate of a country versus the hate that was perpetrated on them. The telling of that is perceived as hateful and not a love of country. And I think that that's what sort of creates a bit of resentment, if you will, among, and a complicated relationship with one's country. I think African Americans and many other, and Jewish Americans and others have shown time and again that despite mistreatment, there's an intense love for the country, but not so much love for the treatment of how they've been treated. And I think some folks have a difficulty separating that for whatever reasons. Maybe whether it's guilt, whether it's anger or whatever, not wanting to reconcile that, I think is very interesting, and I think creates complicated discussions around such issues. But
the distance between experience and ideal.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, well, we're all engaged in this great experiment of American democracy because of what we believe it can be. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that probably is a little different, maybe.
Yeah.
For different folks. And but I think that sometimes, like I said, the distance between that and the reality on the ground is that's where the tension lies, right? Yeah. So, anybody you want to share, Kevin?
No,
any ladies in your life who have been particularly?
Well, obviously, I would, like you, I'd start close to home with my mother and grandmother. I think that's one of the interesting things about the way we regard women's history and their contributions to our society, because I think if you would ask anyone, male or female, who are some of the greatest influencers or had the impacts on their lives, most likely their mothers. It's women, women who raise and nurture families, who keep households together, who are oftentimes some of the strongest, emotionally and physically and other things. These are folks that we grow up, who we depend on, who keep things moving,
kind of the core.
Or in many ways who enable men in some places to be able to be off pursuing other interests. And so I think that, for me, I'd start with those, both my grandmothers and my mother, who were that for me, growing up. And I can say undoubtedly, if not for their teaching, their love, their influence, I wouldn't be who I am today. My dad was a great man, but
he wasn't your mom.
He wasn't my mom. And, if we're talking about historical figures, I think, Shirley Chisholm is somebody who I would certainly say, was someone who I grew up, Harriet Tubman, obviously. And I think, even women like Michelle Obama, these days, who I think is every bit as dynamic as her husband is. I think about Nancy Reagan in as I grew up, one could arguably say she was every bit as big as Ronald Reagan was in terms of the way that she put herself out there. And so, with some of the initiatives she did as First Lady, I grew up on some of that stuff. So, those are just a few names I'd toss out.
Well, I'll close out. So, I'm going to follow suit with the moms and grandmas. Mm-hmm. It's like strong women. May we raise them. May we be raised by them. And so just thinking about the legacy of raising two girls myself, I'm two. There you go. And I am the first one in my family to have more than one girl. So it was always sort of the lone girl. My mom was one of boys. My grandma was one of boys. I was one of boys, brothers. And so, just that quiet strength, I think, really holds true for me too, and both my mom and my grandmothers. And so, cheers to them. And as I think about the context of our work at HHC, there were a few names and sort of stories that emerged for me. One is Ariella Heilman, actually her mother, who was a resistance fighter, essentially, like a saboteur during the war. She was part of the Sonderkommando uprising. So this was a group of women at Auschwitz who were able to, as prisoners, in those conditions, smuggle tiny little bits of gunpowder to deliver those to the Sonderkommando, who were the prisoners who were forced to work the crematoria, which is just some of the most gut-wrenching testimony you can imagine. And they were able to actually blow up a crematoria. So, even just remembering that, people did not stand by, even under the threat of incredible stakes and circumstances and, consequences, that there were people who found ways, even in those conditions, to stand up is so powerful. And women too, it was, there's a lot, obviously, that's been written, a lot of scholarship on women in the Holocaust, and just the experience of, obviously, not just persecution, but all of the horrific sexual crimes that happened. Was an incredibly difficult situation. The fact that she found a way to be an upstander in the middle of that is pretty remarkable. And then also, I think about, maybe a little closer to home, so many of our survivors talk about, particularly those who were privileged to still have with us, because many of the folks who are still alive were children at the time. And they talk about, their mothers being the ones to keep them alive, safe, relatively healthy, in the midst of the most unimaginable circumstances. Henry Fenichel talking about his mother smuggling crumbs of bread every day during, rations to save for Shabbat, right? Because it was so important to maintain tradition, even in a place of relative hopelessness. And I think about Conrad Weiner, who talks about his mother nursing him back to health. And I think about Zahava Rendler, who talks about how her mother had the courage to give her up as a baby when they were in hiding. Who knew if she was ever going to see her again? But she said, this child needs a fair shot, and it's not going to happen in this bunker with us. And so she gave her to a convent, and the nuns raised her in Poland during the war, and they were able to reunite afterwards miraculously. So just the strength in so many different ways of women is it's inspiring, and something I think we can carry with us today. So any other closing thoughts before we wrap up on women's history, Black history, the intersection of the two? No.
Well, I would just say, I think both institutions, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and the Holocaust and Humanities Center, I think the stories that both of these institutions tell about the stories, whether that's men, women, Black, Jewish, there are just so many stories of many names whose people have never heard before, but have such marvelous stories. The one you recounted, my wife and I were at the Freedom Center over the summer, and I can remember that story being told there. And we were amazed by that same story that you just told. And it's like every time you go into one of these institutions and you hear the stories, it just reminds you of how remarkable, not just of the horrors that people are capable of, but of the tremendous strength and the tremendous innovation and the tremendous perseverance and the indomitable nature, of the human will that is inspiring. And I think that's one of the things I admire about both institutions, is that there are a whole lot of men and women that I wouldn't have ever known about or have heard of before, but for, going through the exhibits and reading about these extraordinary individuals whose names might have been lost to history, but for, the efforts that you guys put in for that. So thank you.
We need to continue to do the work.
Yeah.
Yes.
One step at a time. Well, thank you to Shawnee for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And for the work you do every day. It's a
Too.
privilege as we think about two, museums in town doing such parallel work in so many ways, and sort of anchored in different identity spaces, but that speaks to and fuels and inspires sort of a broader commitment to our shared humanity. It's really an honor to be in the space with you. And thanks for everybody for listening along. And if you are interested in any of the things we talked about, as always, that's in the show notes. Arielle Heilman is speaking at HHC later this month. So check the show notes for more information about that if you want to learn more about her story. And I guess we'll see you next time. Thanks again. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. The managing producer is Ann Thompson, technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kick Lee, and this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partner Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.